The death certificate said cardiac arrhythmia. The autopsy revealed 14 different drugs in his system. The funeral drew crowds that rivaled heads of state. The grave at Graceland became one of the most visited sites in America. Every piece of official documentation confirmed what the world already knew. Elvis Aaron Presley died on August 16, 1977, at the age of 42. Yet in 2016, a 73-second video uploaded to YouTube would challenge every single one of those facts and reignite a conspiracy theory that had smoldered for nearly 4 decades. The man in the footage wasn't supposed to exist. According to every official record, Elvis Presley had been dead for 39 years. But there he was, or at least there was someone who looked remarkably, disturbingly, impossibly like what an 81-year-old Elvis Presley would look like, working as a groundskeeper at Graceland, walking the same paths where tour guides told visitors about the king's tragic demise. The internet detectives went to work immediately, analyzing gait patterns, facial bone structure, hand gestures, even the way the mystery man wore his baseball cap. Some claimed to spot Elvis's distinctive mannerisms. Others pointed to the timing. The video surfaced during Elvis Week, when thousands of fans descended on Memphis. And when the man raised 2 fingers in a peace sign and appeared to mouth words at the camera, the theory exploded into the mainstream. What if the most documented death in entertainment history had been an elaborate hoax? Before we dive deeper into this mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the untold stories of music's greatest legends. The footage appeared innocuous at first. Graceland's meticulously maintained grounds stretched out in the background, the mansion's white columns gleaming in the Tennessee sunlight. But the camera was tracking a lone figure moving methodically through the garden beds, a maintenance worker in a gray-blue shirt and worn baseball cap. His movements slow and deliberate as he tended to the flower beds that surrounded Elvis Presley's former home. Nothing remarkable, nothing out of the ordinary, just another day at one of America's most famous tourist destinations. Then the man looked up. The moment his face turned toward the camera, social media would never be the same. The gray beard couldn't hide the distinctive jawline that millions had seen move in countless concerts and films. The baseball cap sat low, but not low enough to obscure the facial structure that cosmetic surgeons had studied and tried to replicate for decades. And those eyes, even at a distance, even through the grainy quality of smartphone footage, carried something hauntingly familiar. He raised his right hand, formed a peace sign with 2 fingers, and held it there for a beat too long to be casual. His lips moved, and though no sound accompanied the gesture, lip readers around the world would swear they saw him mouth 2 words that sent chills down the spines of Elvis fans everywhere. "I'm alive." Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times. Within days, millions. The comments section exploded into warfare between believers who saw undeniable proof that the king had faked his death, and skeptics who dismissed it as wishful thinking from fans who'd never accepted the loss of their hero. But something about this particular sighting felt different from the countless Elvis claims that had circulated since 1977. This wasn't a blurry photograph from a truck stop in Michigan or a questionable witness account from a Las Vegas casino. This was video footage, shot at Graceland itself, showing a man who worked at the very place where Elvis was supposedly buried. The audacity of it, the sheer boldness of hiding in plain sight at the world's second most visited house in America after the White House, gave the theory a narrative power that previous sightings had lacked. The call came into the Memphis Fire Department at 2:43 p.m. on August 16, 1977. The address alone sent emergency responders' hearts racing. 3777 Elvis Presley Boulevard. By the time paramedics arrived at Graceland's front gates, precious minutes had already been lost. They were rushed upstairs to the master bathroom, where they found Elvis Aaron Presley, the king of rock and roll, lying face down on the thick shag carpet, his body already cold to the touch. At 42 years old, the man who'd sold over 1 billion records worldwide, who'd defined an entire generation's sound and style, was gone, or so the official story went. The autopsy, performed by Dr. Jerry Francisco, listed the cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia, essentially a heart attack brought on by years of prescription drug abuse. The toxicology report painted a devastating picture: codeine, Valium, morphine, Demerol, and at least 9 other substances coursed through Elvis's system at the time of death. His personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, had written prescriptions for over 10,000 pills in the 8 months before Elvis's death. The evidence seemed overwhelming and tragic. Elvis had died the way so many predicted he would, a victim of his own excess and the enabling of those around him. The funeral, held 2 days later on August 18th, drew an estimated 50,000 mourners to the gates of Graceland. The casket, a 900-pound copper coffin lined with cream velvet, sat in the mansion's foyer as fans filed past for one final goodbye. Elvis wore a white suit, hands crossed over his chest, the famous face finally at rest after years of visible suffering. The image was broadcast globally, yet even as the motorcade wound its way to Forest Hill Cemetery, whispers began circulating through the crowd. Something felt wrong, something felt staged, and in the decades that followed, those whispers would grow into a roar that refused to be silenced, no matter how much official documentation existed to prove the king was really truly gone. To understand the groundskeeper theory, you first have to understand the psychology of why millions of people desperately needed Elvis to still be alive. This wasn't just about a celebrity death that fans couldn't accept. This was about the destruction of an icon in the most humiliating way possible. Elvis didn't die in a plane crash like Buddy Holly, or go out in a blaze of glory on stage. He died alone on a bathroom floor, bloated beyond recognition, killed by an addiction that had been visible to everyone but somehow unstoppable. For the generation that had grown up with Elvis, that had seen him transform from the dangerous hip-shaking rebel of 1956 to the white-suited Vegas performer of the 70s, this ending felt like a betrayal. They'd watched his decline in real time. The weight gain, the slurred speech during concerts, the canceled shows, the desperate final performances where he could barely remember lyrics to songs he'd sung thousands of times. The man who'd been young and beautiful and vital had become a cautionary tale about the price of fame. But what if it didn't have to end that way? What if the bathroom death was theater, one final performance from the world's greatest showman? The theory gained strength from Elvis's own words in his final years. In interviews and private conversations, he'd expressed a deep longing for privacy, for normalcy, for the ability to walk down a street without being mobbed. He'd told close friends that he felt trapped by his fame, that the character of Elvis Presley had become a costume he could never take off. In this context, faking his death didn't seem like paranoid fantasy, but rather a logical escape route for a man who'd spent 23 years as the most famous person on the planet. And if you were Elvis Presley and you wanted to disappear, what would you do? You'd stage a death believable enough that the world would mourn and move on. You'd use your wealth to set up a new identity. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'd stay close to the one place on Earth that had always felt like home: Graceland. The idea had a poetic symmetry to it, a narrative elegance that conspiracy theories often lack. Elvis hadn't run away to a beach in the Bahamas. He'd stayed exactly where he belonged, living out his final years in the shadows of his former glory, tending the gardens of the estate where he'd once been king. When the 2016 video went viral, amateur investigators immediately began dissecting every frame with forensic intensity. The analysis started with facial structure. The human skull doesn't change significantly with age, and Elvis's bone structure had been photographed from every conceivable angle throughout his career. Forensic artists began overlaying images of the groundskeeper onto photographs of Elvis from the 1970s, adjusting for nearly 4 decades of aging. The results were startling. The distance between the eyes matched. The shape of the jaw, even beneath the gray beard, corresponded to Elvis's distinctive lower face. The slope of the forehead, the set of the ears, the overall proportions aligned with mathematical precision. One analysis claimed a 92% facial recognition match, though the methodology behind that number was never fully explained. Beyond facial features, researchers examined body language and movement patterns. Elvis had a distinctive way of carrying himself, a particular gait that came from years of performing in platform shoes and heavy jumpsuits. The groundskeeper moved with a slight hip rotation that some observers claimed was identical to Elvis's walk. His hand gestures, particularly the two-fingered peace sign he flashed at the camera, were analyzed against thousands of photographs of Elvis making similar gestures. Then there was the matter of timing and location. The video surfaced during Elvis Week, the annual August commemoration when tens of thousands of fans descend on Memphis. In the chaos of that week, with crowds overwhelming the property, a groundskeeper could move through the gardens virtually unnoticed. But here's where the theory took its most intriguing turn. What if being noticed was the point? What if, after nearly 4 decades of anonymity, an 81-year-old Elvis Presley had decided to give his most devoted fans one final gift? The peace sign held just a beat too long, the direct look into the camera, the apparent movement of lips forming words. None of this felt accidental. It felt performative, theatrical, like a wink from beyond the grave to those who'd never stopped believing. Believers examined the background, identifying the exact location within Graceland's grounds and noting that it was near the meditation garden where Elvis and his mother Gladys were eventually laid to rest. Could there be deeper meaning in the groundskeeper's choice to work in that specific area? As the controversy raged, the groundskeeper himself came forward. Bill Barmer, a longtime Graceland employee, identified himself as the worker in the footage and categorically denied that he was Elvis Presley in disguise. Barmer expressed bemusement at the controversy, stating simply that he was an 81-year-old maintenance worker doing his job and nothing more. He'd simply looked up when he noticed someone filming and made a friendly gesture. But conspiracy thinking doesn't work that way. Believers immediately dismissed Barmer's denial as exactly what Elvis would say if he were trying to maintain his cover. Of course he would deny it. That was the whole point of faking your death. Some theorists went further, suggesting that Bill Barmer was itself a pseudonym, an identity created for an Elvis who'd been living under an assumed name for decades. Barmer's denials, clear and consistent, should have ended the theory. But they didn't, because conspiracy theories once established become unfalsifiable. Every piece of contradicting evidence is reframed as part of the conspiracy. The theory becomes a closed loop, self-reinforcing and impervious to external reality. The groundskeeper theory was simply the latest in a long tradition of Elvis sightings that began almost the moment his death was announced. Within weeks of August 16, 1977, sightings were being reported across the country. Elvis pumping gas in Michigan, Elvis shopping in California, Elvis eating at a diner in Texas. One of the most famous early sightings occurred in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where a woman named Louise Welling claimed to have met Elvis at a Burger King in 19. She took a photograph with the man, and the image became one of the most widely circulated pieces of evidence in the Elvis is alive community. The sightings followed predictable patterns. Elvis was always seen in working-class settings: diners, gas stations, supermarkets, truck stops. He was never spotted at exclusive restaurants where someone with Elvis's wealth might plausibly hide. This consistency actually strengthened the theory for some believers, who argued that a man trying to escape fame would naturally gravitate toward ordinary, anonymous places. Psychologists studying the phenomenon noted that Elvis sightings shared characteristics with religious visions. They occurred most frequently among people who had a deep emotional connection to Elvis. The sightings often happened during periods of personal stress, suggesting that the vision of Elvis served a psychological function, providing comfort during difficult times. But the Graceland groundskeeper video had something other sightings didn't have. It showed Elvis at Graceland itself, the one place where his presence would be both most unlikely and most meaningful. The location transformed the theory from just another sighting into something approaching mythology. This wasn't Elvis hiding in anonymous America. This was Elvis returning to the only home that had ever mattered, walking the grounds where he'd raised his daughter Lisa Marie, where he'd mourned his mother. Graceland had always been more than just a house to Elvis. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, the physical manifestation of his success and his imprisonment. He'd bought it in 1957 for $100,000 when he was just 22 years old. In his final years, Graceland had become a gilded cage. He rarely left the property, conducting his life entirely within its walls. The world outside had become too intense, too demanding, too dangerous. So the idea of Elvis never really leaving Graceland held a certain tragic poetry. Perhaps he'd never left because he couldn't leave. because Graceland was the only place he'd ever felt safe. The groundskeeper theory's explosive growth in 2016 reflected something new in how conspiracy theories spread in the digital age. Unlike earlier Elvis sightings that spread through photocopies and word of mouth, the groundskeeper video went viral instantly, shared across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube within hours of its upload. The YouTube algorithm, designed to maximize engagement, recognized that videos about the Elvis sighting were generating massive view counts. It began recommending these videos to anyone who'd ever watched Elvis-related content, creating a feedback loop that exposed millions of people to the theory. Within weeks, response videos appeared, some analyzing the footage frame by frame, others featuring interviews with Graceland employees, still others presenting elaborate theories about how Elvis could have faked his death. Each video fed the algorithm, generated more recommendations, and drew more people into the rabbit hole. The comment sections became battlegrounds where believers and skeptics waged war, each side presenting evidence and dismissing the other's arguments. The intensity of the debate itself became content, with creators making videos about the arguments happening in other videos' comment sections. This digital amplification transformed what might have been a minor curiosity into a cultural moment. Mainstream media outlets began covering the story, often with a tongue-in-cheek tone that acknowledged the implausibility while still giving airtime to the theory's most passionate advocates. Elvis represents something more than just a musician who died too young. He represents a particular moment in American culture, a brief window when the country was transforming from the buttoned-up conformity of the 1950s into the chaotic experimentation of the 1960s. Elvis was the catalyst for that transformation, the white boy who moved like black performers, who brought rhythm and blues into white teenagers' bedrooms, who made sexuality overt and dangerous and thrilling. He changed everything: fashion, music, the relationship between youth culture and commercial culture, the very idea of what a performer could be. And then he became a prisoner of that change, locked into being Elvis for the rest of his life, unable to evolve or escape. The trajectory of his life seemed to contain a moral lesson about fame and America and the price of dreams. It was too perfect a narrative arc to feel like random events. And if it was a narrative, a story rather than merely facts, then maybe the ending could be rewritten. Maybe the tragic fall didn't have to be the final chapter. This desire for a different ending explains why the Graceland groundskeeper theory resonated so powerfully despite its implausibility. It offered the hero's return, the final stage of the mythological journey, where the hero comes home transformed but alive. Elvis didn't die in that bathroom. He transformed, shedding the persona of Elvis Presley, and returned to the only home that mattered to live out his days in humble service to the land and legacy he'd created. So what's the truth about the Graceland groundskeeper? The evidence, weighed objectively, points to a simple conclusion. Bill Barmer was exactly who he said he was, a Graceland employee who happened to bear a passing resemblance to what an elderly Elvis might look like, and who had the misfortune of being filmed when the internet's hunger for mystery was particularly intense. The facial analysis shows at most a superficial similarity, enhanced by confirmation bias and low-resolution video. The autopsy evidence, the testimony of medical professionals, the documentation of Elvis's declining health, all of this weighs against the survival hypothesis with overwhelming force. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977. His body was autopsied, embalmed, displayed in an open casket for thousands of mourners, and eventually buried in Graceland's meditation garden. These are facts, documented and verified. But facts exist in one realm, and belief exists in another. For millions of Elvis fans, the groundskeeper theory isn't really about whether Elvis is literally alive. It's about keeping alive the possibility of magic in a world that increasingly seems to have none. About refusing to accept that legends die the same way ordinary people do. When fans share the groundskeeper video or debate its authenticity, they're participating in a ritual of remembrance, a way of saying that Elvis still matters, that his story isn't finished. Elvis remains more present in American culture than many living performers. Graceland still welcomes over 500,000 visitors every year, so maybe the question of whether he's biologically alive misses the point. Maybe what matters is that we're still here, decades later, still arguing about him, still analyzing grainy videos for signs of his presence, still needing him to be alive in whatever way we can make that true. Today, the video that sparked the 2016 groundskeeper theory frenzy still circulates, accumulating new views and new comments from believers and skeptics alike. Bill Barmer presumably continues his duties maintaining the grounds, perhaps with a bemused awareness that to thousands of people around the world, he'll always be something more than just a groundskeeper. And Elvis Presley remains where he's been since August 16, 1977, buried in Graceland's meditation garden, his grave marked by a simple bronze plaque, his legacy secure as one of the most influential figures in American music history. The king is dead. Long live the king. And somewhere in the space between those two statements lies the enduring mystery that keeps fans watching, believing and searching for signs that maybe, just maybe, the greatest performer who ever lived saved his most spectacular trick for last.